Socrates says to Euthyphro, "Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods?" It's a good question. Uh, so for Christians, modern Christians, and endless online debates, is something good because a god commands it? Can a god say murder is evil on Monday and good on Tuesday? I think most people would say no, goodness is not that arbitrary. Um, so then, follow-up question. Is something good because it corresponds to a god's good nature, which is the source of the supposedly good commands? And then you gotta, point out that different gods can have arbitrarily different natures. That doesn't necessarily make any of them good. If you're going to go through a bunch of gods and you're going to say, hey, this god's like this god's like that, they can't all be good, can they? Arbitrarily trusting a god's commands is just as arbitrary as trusting a god's nature. All the commands are going to come from the natures anyhow. From the heart, the mouth speaks. So, is a god's nature good because it is metaphysically synonymous with the very abstract concept of goodness itself? Maybe. I don't know how we'd know. But if we already know what the concept of good is, apart from the mystery of whether or not it is intrinsically synonymous with supersentience, then what do we need the mystery God for? And then, to identify, what an abstract entity of goodness is, if we need to go there, maybe we don't. But they're the things and relationships that exist in reality, and then there are physical thoughts in our head that also exist in reality, like files and programs in a computer that understand or process those things in relationships. So there's no other thing in the mix. So when it comes to goodness, there's just our minds processing it, and then there's the actual things in the world and relationships that are established that we can identify as good or bad, if we have like real definition of that. But that's what this is about. So a follow-up theistic question that, see, we keep moving the goalposts here. We said it's not the commands, not necessarily the God's nature. Can't necessarily just add goodness to a God's nature arbitrarily. And how would we know without already knowing what goodness is? But somebody might say, is a God's nature non-moral but yields good commands anyway? And this seems to admit that theistic goodness is just as metaphysically arbitrary as an evolutionarily inherited moral nature. Why not just take our own natures and carefully fix the inconsistencies? What's the difference? But the point is, if you can't already figured it out, our own natures are what are telling us what is good and bad, even if we're getting that wrong somehow. We know we do want joy, love, self-respect, good friendships, security, trust, commitment, peace, tranquility, sanity, positivity, self-improving behavior, sense of purpose and self-worth, positive social climates. And we know that we don't want misery, loneliness, self-loathing, bad friendships, fear, paranoia, discontentment, anxiety, stress, neurosis, depression, self-destructive behavior, purposelessness, worthlessness, and a negative social climate. So, but if we independently know these things constitute good versus evil, and in fact our own natures are what tell us what good is to even know which God to go looking for, then we don't need the God grounding and can figure out moral questions ourselves, potentially. So it is independently obvious most humans have moral natures. The Bible acknowledges that we have our own moral natures, and many theistic arguments use those moral natures as springboards, as premises in their arguments to try to argue for God. But the point is, we do have those natures. We don't have God. We don't have realistic verification that any holy book is from any God. We don't have the abstract entity goodness or verification that abstract entity happens to be one with any God's nature. And without our own moral natures, we wouldn't be able to identify any of these things as genuinely good anyhow, even if they were right in front of us. Evidence galore. Without already having figured out what goodness is on our own terms. And if we have figured out goodness And if we figured out goodness incorrectly, we're going to pick the wrong moral theory. We're going to pick the wrong God. We're going to pick the wrong abstract entity of goodness, or any combination of those. If we've figured it out poorly, we're not going to identify whatever is being presented to us, regardless of the level of evidence that we have. And so this gets into, well, trying to understand deep, I listed out a bunch of things like, well, these are good things and these are bad things, and everybody who's not insane identifies those things. And even if we're gonna, squabble and quibble over, various points, we still generally, have a general orientation towards goodness and badness. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't even be having these conversations or be able to ask any of these questions. So to more formally try to break that down to what the underlying pattern is in a way that perhaps could be used to program artificial intelligence with the ability to consistently recognize what good things are versus what bad things are, I'm going to present my take on what's known as the ethical theory desire utilitarianism, or desirism. And to me it goes like this. Morality, when properly understood, is at its root mere principled desiring. All desires are inherently value neutral outside of the relationship to other desires. However, we may identify good desires as desires that tend to fulfill other desires, and bad desires are desires that tend to thwart other desires. Desires by their very nature want to be fulfilled and do not want to be thwarted. All rational, desiring beings will therefore recognize the principle here. Even evil people hate it when you stop them from getting what they want. And so the remaining portion is for the evil people to not be thwarting other people's desires in the first place. Good people are sentient collections of desires that tend to fulfill both their own desires and the relevant desires of others in a stable, ongoing way. And bad people are sentient collections of desires that will, at least on occasion, drastically thwart the desires of others unnecessarily, or even drastically thwart their own. And the more often and the more drastic and the more arbitrary this thwarting is, the worse and more monstrous we rightly feel them to be. And this is compatible, desire utilitarianism is compatible with the possibility of a divine moral authority, and that a supreme, perfect, desiring being could logically exist, know most everything there is to know about perfectly principled desiring, and dole out sound and valid advice to lesser desiring beings, such as ourselves. There's no inherent incompatibility there. But the point is that we have our own moral natures that recognize goodness and badness, and we are sufficiently capable, with concerted effort, to get on top of our own hypocrisies and enact a consistent moral theory that treats all desires as equal, apart from their actual relationships to other desires, and as corporate desiring beings. And, Jesus' golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, is a straightforward expression of principled desiring that respects one's neighbor's desires as equivalent to one's own. But Jesus is a little inconsistent here. Jesus could have said, love God, love your fellow humans, and if your God tells you to do something wrong against others, that isn't God. That's not a good God. Instead, Jesus says, love God, love your neighbors, and do what Abraham did, which is to say that when God told Abraham to murder his own son, Abraham was willing to comply and was praised for it by God in the Old Testament and by Jesus and writers in the New Testament. And so Jesus breaks his own golden rule. Let's see, what else is there on this vast argument map here? I think I've covered all the important things. Ultimately, the Euthyphro dilemma is, it's not the God's commands. You can't just arbitrarily trust a God's nature either. You can't just arbitrarily assume a God has the very abstract entity of goodness inherent in its moral nature. Ultimately, you have to figure out what goodness is on your own, and that's being derived from human nature. And obviously, we can still get that wrong. There's 7 billion of us. We're going to have different ideas about how that is, but we can see when some people are more consistent than others. And maybe even one day we can all get completely on top of this together. But anyway, let me know what you think. I think when you break it down, you ultimately have to come up with something like desire utilitarianism. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to put them in the comments.